Economist Corporate Network in Hong Kong. We've just wrapped up our quarterly CEO luncheon where we've spoken about retail market opportunities in Asia, and I'm joined by Torsten Stocker, who's principal with Monitor Group here in Hong Kong and head of your Asian retail practice. Torsten, I found that one of the things that our members spoke quite a lot about was the need to achieve some sort of local point of connection when bringing global brands into Asian markets, particularly China. What do you think is driving the need for localized experience?
Well, I think there are a number of drivers there. I think some of them are fairly obvious. I think if it's food, then it has to fit in with the taste profile and the taste experience profile that consumers have. If it's clothes, obviously, it has to fit their body shapes and has to fit their climates and their color preferences. But I think those are often, the relatively easier adjustments. I mean,
right.
Easier to recognize, not necessarily easy to execute on, because they still take time to work themselves through the system, and they might require change in supply chain, etc., etc. And of course, a lot of global brands, they try also to strike a balance between keeping it as globally consistent as possible, maintaining global scale, but at the same time then becoming locally relevant. But I think some of the more sort of interesting drivers that are emerging is really around or in categories that maybe haven't been established in a country before, where you almost have to create the category, where you have to educate consumers, and where consumers themselves sort of adapt it into their own lifestyles or their own life situations in ways that previously you couldn't really anticipate.
Right.
And I think we had a great example during the conversation here today from Starbucks. I think that made it very, very locally relevant. I think we had some other great examples from some of the apparel brands,
right.
the F Corporation, in where it's not only about, as I mentioned, the color and the fit, but it's also around how you communicate the brand.
Right.
Maybe if you're an outdoor brand, you don't focus on climbing Mount Everest and sleeping on a ledge in a hailstorm and being kept warm.
And other foolish pursuits.
Exactly, but you're really focusing on being out in nature and connecting with nature in a very spiritual way.
That's right.
So I think that's really I would say the sort of second or even third stage of localization.
Right. Now there's some brands obviously that by design, because they are wrapped up in presenting a lifestyle or provenance that informs the brand. I'm thinking mostly in the European luxury sector, where localization is almost precisely not the point, but we got the sense that while they're not necessarily changing products, they're localizing in terms of certainly increasing the amounts of the amount of footprint within the region. Do you think that the slowdown in the second half of this year is going to perhaps put the brakes on retail store expansion in Asia in 2013?
Well, I think temporarily, for some players that might well be the case, and I think it has been the case sort of looking back at the last 12 months,
right.
Where I think some of the very ambitious expansion plans were scaled back or were slowed down, and where companies have focused more on improving the productivity of the assets that they've already invested in.
Right.
And maybe expanding more around the edges of that rather than going out there and opening a lot more stores.
Right, right.
But I think certainly as far as China is concerned, I think this is ultimately just a temporary slowdown, and I think a lot of the big fundamental growth drivers are still there. So I would expect that sooner or later the path of the pace of expansion will pick up again.
Right. Now we spoke a little bit about Japan's expansion aspirations, given the slow grow, no grow market that domestic retailers find themselves in, and I'm reminded of expansion plans like the convenience store chain Lawson that, if you believe their rhetoric, wants to create as many stores in China as they have in Japan today inside of 10 years. You were saying that the interesting regional expansion champion wasn't necessarily Japan, but Korea.
Yes, and I wouldn't necessarily sort of say that it's only Korean companies or so, but I've certainly seen, I think first of all, seen a lot of Korean consumer brands come into their own, so to speak. Whereas maybe 10, 15 years ago, I think they were a lot less sophisticated. I think they were themselves focusing on just being a famous label, similar to what we see with some of the Chinese brands now. Mm-hmm. But I think they've really invested in building their capabilities. I think they've fine-tuned the model in Korea, and now have been ready for the past few years to expand and to take this into other Asian markets. So it'll be obviously easier for some sectors, where there is maybe a natural affinity that other Asian consumers have for Korean products. Sort of skincare and beauty care is one of the obvious ones.
Right.
I think sort of fashion and apparel, I think, is the second one. Where we see some Korean brands expanding, but it sometimes happens in sort of very non-obvious sectors.
Right.
So if you look at the household food storage containers, one of the leaders in China is a Korean company called Lock & Block.
Okay.
And the way they've actually really, you could almost say, sewn up that market is by teaching people that you need to have 4 locks at every corner. So if you're like a Tupperware and you want to get into that market and you don't have that, you have to convince consumers that despite not having the 4 locks, your products will still not open by accident and will keep the smell in.
Right. Okay. And finally, Torsten, you made an interesting point when we wrapped up about taking these localized concepts or in global brands which have responded to localized requirements, perhaps the long-term future of the investment in creating a brand that's relevant to Chinese consumers. The Starbucks example where they're transforming their brand from Starbucks China to China Starbucks. Perhaps there's something in that for global firms as they reinvigorate their brands outside of Asian markets. Can they take these things they've learned in China and other Asian markets back out into the global stage?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. And of course, just in the same way that companies shouldn't have or didn't succeed in just trying to bring concepts from their home market one-to-one into China, into Asia, I don't think they should make the same mistake and now expect that they can pick something that was successful in China and plug it back into the US or into Europe. But I think at the same time, I think there will be a number of both sort of products that might ultimately be relevant for those markets that have been developed here. There might be concepts that have been developed here that suddenly become relevant, for example, in convenience retail or even in the way that maybe luxury is sold in some Asian markets. But I think more important, there can also be some sort of ideas or some innovations that travel back from China or from Asia to markets. For example, to cite again Starbucks, who came into China and really literally had to help educate consumers and build up the industry. Who's to say that there aren't some ideas there in how they have become relevant to a non-coffee drinking culture that might not be relevant to how to gain growth in a market that may be a coffee drinking market, but where people are just not that open to going to a coffee shop, but where they drink coffee at home or drink it in the office, and where they feel that sort of buying it outside is just too much money to spend on. Where you can actually become much more locally relevant because you apply the same type of mindset or the same type of ideas that you've had to hone and fine-tune here in markets in Asia to other markets globally.
Right, so perhaps an extension of this notion of frugal innovation, which has guided a lot of manufacturing in Asia to success in global markets, maybe some sort of retail-specific version of that.
And it might not necessarily have to be frugal. I think it can just be about sort of really uncovering some critical consumer insights and how you become relevant in a particular market. that might then also drive new concepts or some innovation in markets back in Europe.
Right. Torsten, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I'm Ross O'Brien with the Economist Corporate Network in Hong Kong. We've just wrapped up our retail mini summit here in the Grand Hyatt in Hong Kong. Thank you very much for watching.